I'm gonna take this ribeye roll, cut off the ribeye cap, and cut the rest into ribeye fillets. Okay, kids, let me tell you where ribeyes come from. Now, you guys seem to love it when I show you different meat hacks with giant pieces of meat. So who am I to deny you? I'm gonna show you a pretty unconventional but super cool way to cut this ribeye roll up. And we're not cutting ribeye steaks. I got this from my local H-E-B grocery here in Texas. You literally just walk in and say, hey, I need a ribeye roll. You tell them which grade you want and they'll sell it to you just like this. This one is prime because you're worth it. First step is to get it out of the packaging. Einstein. First thing, I'm going to wipe it dry because that makes it easier to work with. This whole section comes from like the top spine of the steer. If you flip it over, you can actually see these are where they took the ribs out. So normally you just take a knife and you'd start cutting, and that's how you make ribeye steaks. It's very easy. If you are a meat nerd like I am, you know that the best piece of meat on the whole animal is called the spinalis dorsi. It's one muscle that comes from this cut right here. But if you take it off, you usually ruin the ribeye steak. So it's very, very hard to find, which is why we're going to cut it ourselves. First thing you got to do is find that spinalis or that rib cap. And when we take it off, it's actually going to look kind of like a flank steak. So if you look at this end, the steak kind of looks like a strip steak. You've just got one big eye of muscle there. And the reason it looks like a strip steak is because the continuation of this muscle is where strip steaks come from. But if I flip it over, that's the same muscle on this end. It's much smaller, and this is a whole separate muscle here. And to check, you can kind of pry it apart here. See how that comes apart really easily? This is the spinalis. This is the ribeye cap, and that's the ribeye eye. So I'm going to take this whole thing off. You can kind of just use your fingers to start. At least this tells me where to make my first couple of cuts. So all I have to do is just follow the seams. And you can start by just using your hands. I love that sound. Because it's a separate muscle, you nearly don't need to do any work at all with the knife to take it off. It'll come apart really easily. You can see what I'm doing, right? I'm literally just separating it with my fingers. And if you come across any like real tough connective tissue, just give it a little nick. That's our rib cap, and this is the rest of the ribeye roll. Done. That is your spinalis. Now I have to clean it up. So there's a lot of sinew that runs, especially on the backside, see all that pearlescent stuff? This is a really tender muscle, and if I left that sinew there, it would make for a much tougher bite, and that's not what I'm looking for. So I'm gonna try and trim away as much of this as possible. So the easiest way to cut the silver skin is to take a really sharp trimming knife. This one is from Hardcore Carnivore. Angle the blade towards and just cut along. You don't have to get like every little bit, but try and get it as neat as you can. Scraps you put in a Ziploc bag, you put them in your freezer, and the next time you make a stock, you can chuck them in. So even though this is technically part of the ribeye steak, it's much more flavorful and much more tender than the rest of the ribeye. Pretty happy with how this looks, so now I can tackle the other side. Same thing on this side, that silver skin there, you're gonna have the best eating experience if you can cut it off and take it away. You can kind of use your fingers to see, and like you can feel that it's all hard and nubbly in there. So if it feels gross, if it doesn't feel like lovely soft muscle, you're probably gonna wanna trim it away. And like this bit here, that's the back of one of the ribs, the membrane, so I'm gonna take that off. There comes a point where you do need to just kind of stop messing with it, otherwise you're not gonna be left with very much. So I think that looks good. So I like to leave this whole and grill it just like this. It cooks nice and quickly because it's nice and thin. Swab 'em. So with the rest of this roll, I'm gonna cut fat ribeye steaks that are kind of gonna be ribeye fillets. Another advantage of taking the cap off is you can kind of do some extra fine trimming work, so I can get rid of any extra connective tissue that's now been exposed, which is really just a fancy way of saying the more of that I cut out, the better the eating experience is gonna be. I'm gonna neaten up this area that I took the cap off from. Okay, there's one more bit I gotta take off, and that's the tail. See how this is naturally starting to separate here? I only want this section to make my ribeye fillets, so I'm just gonna work those seams, baby. You can very clearly see the seam. Now this is just a big chunk of fat right here, but here you have a really nice little piece of muscle. So you can cut that up, use it for kebabs, use it for stew. You can also take this fat, let me show you how thick it is. See what I mean? You can render that down and make tallow. Final step, I'm actually gonna take these intercostals off because they're not really supposed to be there. They're a separate muscle, and it'll just help give my fillets a really nice shape. Remember, everything that I'm taking off is still gonna get used. It's nice and round on this end, but it tapers to kind of a rectangular shape. I'm gonna fix that with the help of Mr. Twine. This is the section that I'm gonna cut those ribeye fillets from. So all I need to do is tie the whole thing exactly like it were a tenderloin into a nice long cylinder. Tie these as wide as you want, want, so you can still get some pretty thick ass steaks out of this. Once it looks like it's into kinky stuff, you're ready to cut it into steaks. Obviously, they're going to be a bit thicker up this end. Tell me that that doesn't look just like a fillet, but better because this one actually has flavor. This is the ribeye cap. It's the king of all steaks. This is the one you keep for yourself. We've also cut some ribeye fillets. They're still really good steaks. The rest of this gets separated into stew meat and tallow. And if you can't eat all of this right away, don't worry, just vacuum seal it. And that's how you cut up a ribeye roll like a boss.